D&D is for nerds, and nerds love rules. And when I read the Spelljammer 5th edition box sets, I said, there's not enough rules in that for me. So I went ahead and made some rules for Spelljammer Vessel Combat. Let's take a look. So since the release of the Spelljammer box set for 5th edition, people have been increasingly upset with how little there is in there. But I think there's some good things. I think that's pretty cool. The speed and travel is fine. Spelljammer duels, I think this is very funky. The repair mechanics are fine. It's like, okay, just use the mending cantrip. Crashing is fine. And surprisingly, initiative. Players roll d20 for initiative as a group or side. I like the idea of everybody going on the same turn, then they have to plan and coordinate, and it feels like a crew. Speaking of, what are the problems? The crew rolls, there's not enough of a difference. Says the standard crew is a captain to give orders, a spelljammer to pilot, and one or more crew members to operate its weapons. That kind of stinks. If I'm the captain, I'm just telling people what to do. The pilot, the spelljammer, is basically just controlling movement. And movement is just like your character. It's not complex. There aren't options. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend my whole action loading or aiming or firing a ballista. What happens is, if we think of ship combat using these terms, normal combat sounds a lot more fun. And also to that point, there is this text box in the book about shipboard weapons. It says ballistae and mangonels are the most common, but they are slow to load and fire. Player characters are almost always better off using their own weapons and spells in ship-to-ship combat, and that's not fun. Again, that's just making normal combat sound more fun, which leads to this overemphasis on boarding. Rules is written. I feel that every vessel-to-vessel combat will end with one party boarding another. Essentially, it's just turning cool vessel versus vessel in space combat into normal, okay, now we're on a ship-shaped dungeon fighting each other. Which is fine, but it's not the only thing we want out of this. And finally, some vessels are better than others. I'm comparing the lamprey and hammerhead at the top, just to say, okay, besides the size and cargo, these ships are basically the same, besides a bit of HP buff. So why wouldn't you go for the hammerhead over the lamprey? Sure, it's more expensive, but if you're driving around in your lamprey ship, cruising around the astral sea, you're going to see a hammerhead ship, you're going to engage, you're going to board, and then you're just going to take that. What I think would be fun out of a Spelljammer campaign is that a crew gets a ship, gets attached to it, gets into it, and improves upon that ship as they go. So what do we want out of this? We want fast gameplay, our players to feel like a team in a way that's different than typical combat, and we want players to feel attached to their ship. So what do we need? Okay, we need side initiative with some tweaks. We want specific crew roles that actually do significant things. We want mechanical differences from D&D combat. Ship weapons need to be good. And movement options in combat need to be looked at. For player attachment to the ship, just include some upgrade options. So initiative, you roll a d20 and you add your vessel initiative, which is ship movement divided by 10, rounded up. So for a vessel with a 30-foot movement speed, this would be a +3. For a vessel like the Shrike, which I think has a 80-foot or 70-foot movement speed, it's like a +8 or a +7. Faster ships should get to go first. So players on that ship, or crew members on that ship, act in whatever order accomplishes what they want to do. That means they'll have to coordinate to figure out the most optimal thing to do in that moment. I also want to have a gameplay option for players to break rank, and I'd like to gamify people disobeying the captain so that it doesn't turn into real world drama and frustration. So ship movement options. Turning 90 degrees should cost half the ship's movement, and 180 degrees should cost the full movement. A faster ship is harder to maneuver. For dashing, no weapons can be used that turn if you want to go double speed, full steam ahead, and the pilot has to do a skill check. So speaking of the pilot, and requisite skill checks. We have the crew roles that I've come up with: pilot, captain, cannoneer, mechanic, and sailor. If you have proficiency in Arcana, Nature, or Vehicles, Sea Vehicles, you have proficiency in piloting / spelljamming. Additionally, all of these roles are going to have proficiencies based on other previous proficiencies, so that way there's a bit of natural delegation of whose character is suited to do what, although any proficiencies should be able to be learned by characters. As an action, here's what the pilot can do in a turn of vessel combat. They can make a spelljamming skill check against the piloting DC, which we'll talk about in a sec, to gain full awareness of a specific location they designate on the ship, or within 120 feet of the ship. That's going off this bullet point I put at the top. At any time, a spelljammer can see and hear what's happening on and around the vessel as though you were standing in a location of your choice aboard it. However, in the heat of combat, that should be a little more difficult because you're focusing on multiple things. It's loud, it's crazy, and you've only got a couple seconds. That's why there's an associated DC. Additionally, this check can be used to determine if you successfully dash or turn. So what's the piloting DC? The DC for small ships is 5+ ship initiative and 9+ 13+ for the other sizes. Larger ships are more difficult to maneuver, and they have more physical area for you to try and magically sense if you're a spelljammer, so that's why larger ships are more difficult to maneuver, magically sense, so that is my calculation for piloting DC. Next up is the captain. This is a very important role on a spelljamming vessel, so if you have proficiency in intimidation or persuasion, you have proficiency in captaining, which is a charisma-based skill. So as an action, a captaining skill check against the ship's captaining DC allows the captain to grant their charisma modifier and proficiency bonus to one other crew member's role this turn. This is because the captain's job is to inspire, lead, and instruct members of the crew. That's why captaining is purely a charisma-based skill. And the bonus will be pretty strong for any charisma based character, adding at least like a +8, a +9, or something crazy to another crew member's role, and that's where the captaining DC comes in. That's 5 plus the number of crew members on board. So it requires a stronger force of will to encourage or inspire larger groups of people. If you're finding that it's too easy, you can always just change that arbitrary 5+. It can be a 7+, it can be an 8+. The cannoneer. If you have proficiency in athletics, martial weapons, or firearms, you have proficiency in cannoneering, which would be strength or dex. As an action, a cannoneer can do a cannoneer skill check against the cannoneer DC in order to load once and aim, or aim and fire with their full turn. So the point of this is to take those weapons, those ballistae and mangonels, and make sure you're accomplishing more than just loading or just doing this or just doing that. This is to make these weapons better in ship-to-ship combat, because as it stands, they are not good. So the cannoneer DC would be 12 plus the number of actions it takes to fully load, aim, and fire the weapon you are using, because it is more difficult to fire more complex weaponry. So ballista would be a DC 15. I did stick the giant cannon in here from the GIF or GIF bombard vessel, because this DC breaks down a little bit under scrutiny. I would treat the giant cannon as its own class of weapons, not like a ballista or mangonel, because it would be simply +1 to the DC of a ballista. It would be a DC 16 for the giant cannon, which doesn't make too much sense. Moving on to the mechanic. If you have proficiency in history, sleight of hand, tinker's tools, smith's tools, you have proficiency in mechanics, which would be dex or intelligence. As an action, a mechanic can perform a mechanics skill check against the mechanic DC to grant the ship or a ship-mounted weapon temporary HP equal to 1 plus the amount they exceeded the DC by. Temporary HP, not permanent HP, so this isn't to fix the ship. This is to patch things up and hold it together in the heat of battle. This is another size-based DC, and is based on the damage threshold, because tougher armor and for size more surface area means it's more difficult to repair damage. And for weapons, the DC would be equal to that weapon's AC. Finally is the Sailor. If you have proficiency in acrobatics, nature, or cartographer's tools, you have proficiency in sailing, which is a wisdom-based skill. So you can perform a sailor check against the ship's piloting DC to either give advantage to the pilot on their roll, or to boost the speed of the ship by 5 times your wisdom modifier. So if you have a +3, extra 15 feet. Here is my ugly stat block or character sheet for spelljamming vessels, where you can keep track of all of your DCs. I think writing out all the DCs and knowing where they are, I put them in boxes related to how those DCs are calculated. And by the way, the sailor has the same DC as the pilot. By putting it there, it doesn't make it too hard to remember, because rolling all these dice to do everything you want to do can get a little tedious, but I think that's okay in the face of how much dice rolling you would be doing during normal combat. So let's take a look back at what we said we needed. So fast gameplay. We wanted side initiative with some tweaks. Do I think it would be faster? I think there's a chance your party would spend a long time deciding what to do with their turn, since they get the opportunity to coordinate. It might be in your best interest to set a timer to also kind of simulate the heat of battle, feeling like a team or a crew by using specific roles that do significant things for the team. I think these crew roles are solid. I think there are a couple you don't necessarily need, so for smaller parties it will still work. I think you can toss a couple NPCs on the ship that can take care of some of those other roles, and I don't think too many of them are insanely overpowered. So meaningful mechanical difference from normal D&T combat. Ship weapons, we've partially remedied that by making it easier to use them. We've added a couple movement options in combat so that it's a little bit more strategic, and we've added various other crew member roles to add to that kind of feeling like a team. I think there's more we can do for ship weapons though. And then finally, player attachment to the ship with ship upgrades. I haven't talked about that yet, but I do have some stuff planned. So what problems are there with this homebrew stuff? I think arguing over roles, certain things, certain skills that give proficiency in some of the crew roles are pretty common. And players not proficient in enough things for a full crew. You don't need a mechanic, you don't need a sailor, those things help. Or your DM can give you some NPCs. Some of the DCs for different roles are way lower than other ones. I'm definitely going to adjust it as I go, and I would encourage anybody who would want to use these rules to do the same. The fourth point is one that bothers me, because I came up with these rules to get away from streamlining vessel combat into one thing. I think we maintain the option for players to board. I think we allow players to destroy a ship by shooting at it, and I think we give players the chance to run away. And I think those 3 options are enough to lead to some branching decisions to develop interesting situations. And finally, if we give these rules as DMs to enemy NPCs, it's kind of a lot. I would only focus on the pilot and maybe some cannoneers. A mechanic if you're feeling spicy. These rules are player oriented, so as the DM, it's up to you to implement some of them for enemies so that the game feels balanced, but also manage how much attention and effort you're putting on these random pirates on a squid ship who are just there doing whatever and hanging out. So if you like these rules, I will provide a link to a longer form document explaining how these rules work. I'll include the ship stat block character sheet type thing, and I will provide my ship upgrades soon enough after that to kind of complete this picture of what we can do to fix Spelljammer vessel combat.